10 Worst Execution Methods in History by Metatron History Channel.
Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're going to a deep journey into the most horrible execution methods ever used in history. Now, in order to do this without being demonetized, I'm going to have to appeal to the greatest height of my linguistic creativity to come up with alternatives for words.
Yeah,
that,
I know, he too. By the way, he's subscribed to my channel. We find
apart
amazing.
from that, let's deep dive. According to tradition, the Bull of Phalaris, referred to as the Brazen Bull in English, was created by the bronze sculptor Perillus of Athens as a gift for the tyrant of Agrigento, Phalaris, who reigned from 571 to 555 BC. It was supposedly a life-size hollow bronze casting of a bull with a side door designed to place a victim inside. Now, here is the way this horrible device worked. You would open the door and place a person, whoever was the convict,
I know
inside
this
and
one.
then
I
lock
love
it.
this one.
Then they would turn up a fire underneath the bull and slowly start cooking the contents of the bull. To make this more of a spectacle for the masses, which is really one of the main connecting aspects of all of these execution methods, psychological terror and mass manipulation for the benefit of the ruling authorities, they would
not only something that we know pretty much already, like people enjoy seeing this stuff, they enjoy seeing that, public executions. It also serves as an example so people don't do the very same thing to not have the same results. Welcome, thank you for raiding me, Astray VT. Thank you very much. Welcome raiders, welcome everyone. We are reacting to Metatron's video of Metatron's history channel about 10 worst execution methods in history. Very interesting. Yeah. I hope you guys enjoy, and yeah, let's keep watching.
Add some instruments, kind of similar to flutes or canned instruments.
Thank you very much for reading
the
me,
nostrils
Astray
of the
VT.
bull.
Thank you
This
very
way,
much.
whatever screams that you would hear from the victim would actually be sort of modified and appear as if the statue was alive.
Yeah.
The first to report about the Bull of Phalaris was Pindar, who wrote about 60 years after the death of the tyrant of Agrigento, whom he remembers as him who burnt men with fire within a brazen bull, Phalaris, that had no pity. However, it is Diodorus who gives us a detailed description of the construction of the bull. So let's read it. The sculptor Perilaus made a brazen bull for Phalaris the tyrant to use in punishing his own people.
The sculptor Perilaus made a brazen bull for Phalaris the tyrant to use in punishing his own people, but he was himself the first to make trial of that terrible form of punishment. For in general, those who plan an evil thing aimed at others are usually snared in their own devices. Wow. Wow.
But he was himself the first to make trial of that terrible form of punishment. For in general, those who plan an evil thing aimed at others are usually snared in their own devices. This Phalaris burned to death Perilaus, the well-known Attic worker in bronze, in the brazen bull. Perilaus had fashioned in bronze the contrivance of the bull, making small-sounding pipes in the nostrils and fitting a door for an opening in the bull's side, and this bull he brings as a present to Phalaris. And Phalaris welcomes the man with presents and gives orders that the contrivance be dedicated to the gods. Then that worker in bronze opens the side, the evil device of treachery, and says with inhuman savagery, "If you ever wish to punish some man, O Phalaris, shut him up within the bull and lay a fire beneath it. By his groanings the bull will be thawed to below, and his cries of pain will give you pleasure as they come through the pipes in the nostrils." When Phalaris learnt of this scheme, he is filled with loathing of a man and says, "Come then, Perilaus, do you be the first to illustrate this. Imitate those who will play the pipes and make clear to me the workings of your device." And as soon as Perilaus had crept in to give an example, so he thought, of the sound of the pipes, Phalaris closed up the bull and heaps fire underneath it. But in order the man's death might not pollute the work of bronze, he took him out when half dead and hurled him down the cliffs. 1819. There are several
What the fuck? I don't know which one is worse.
In references to the Bull of Phalaris in classical literature, for example from Cicero to Epicurus, Juvenal, Lucian of Samosata, and even Plotinus. These show how its figure had become part of Greco-Roman folklore. Pindar's reference, close in time and presented as an example of how the memory of misdeeds as well as good deeds is indelible in history,
karma.
suggests that the story of the bull was already well known in the Greek world shortly after Phalaris' death. The fact that we have so many mentions within ancient literature of the brazen bull kind of signifies the fact that already within the collective imagination of the masses it had become a symbol of cruelty and tyranny. The story was in fact used as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked power and the importance of justice and compassion in leadership. Despite the widespread references to the bull in literature, there is no archaeological evidence to support its actual existence. Some scholars suggest that the story may have been an invention or exaggeration, perhaps inspired by real torture devices or methods used by tyrants of the time. Regardless of its historical authenticity or lack thereof, the story had become already in the classical period a great example of the sort of suffering that could come as a result of unjust rule. In fact, we read, "Friend, be not deceived by time-serving words of guile, but him who burnt men with fire with a brazen bull, Phalaris, that had no pity." While the recurring references to the bull of Phalaris in classical literature, such as Pindar's mention, which is close to Phalaris in time and could be considered almost period, might suggest that the bull actually existed and was used by the tyrant of Agrigento as a form of execution, several modern historians propose that it may have been a literary topos. Phalaris in fact became a typical model in classical literature to denounce the existence of tyrants from the archaic period, and the story of the bull is often explicitly used as a sort of parable among the cruelty of the aristocratic rulers, or as the ultimate example of pain. If you look up the names Saint Antipas and Saint Eustace, you'll notice that even within Christian discourse there are mentions of saints that were in fact executed by this device. In this case, we're even less certain that it actually happened. What we can learn from this is that the widespread of the Bull of Phalaris in literature and religious stories, despite the lack of concrete evidence for it, demonstrates the power of the narrative as a cautionary tale and a symbol of oppression. The ancient tale of the Bull of Phalaris may remain as a potent metaphor of the consequences of unchecked cruelty, and as a reminder of the importance of questioning the actions of those in power. This word, which can be translated as a slow process, slow erosion, or slow offense, was a form of capital punishment that emerged in China around the 13th century and remained in vogue until 1905, when it was abolished during the final years of the Qing dynasty. During this method, after the victim was secured to a wooden frame in a public place, the executioner proceeded to inflict repeated wounds with a sharp knife, cutting portions of the body until death occurred. As we read the period sources, we don't really have precise information as, for example, the exact number of cuts or which areas of the body had to be cut, but we do know that over 100 cuts have been mentioned, and sometimes this sort of execution had to be prolonged for days, according to imperial orders. We do have, however, a report of sometimes the families of or the loved ones of the person who's going to be executed bribing the executioner, asking him to make sure to just do one cut and get it over with, usually in this area. This method was imposed for those crimes that, according to Chinese law, but above all the period morality, subverted the natural order of universal harmony, directly damaging, from a mystical point of view, the cohesion of the cosmos itself. These were crimes perpetrated by the subject against the sovereign, by the son against the father, by the wife against the husband, by the disciple against the master, and in general by those who were perceived as an inferior against those who were perceived within its custom and society as superior. This method was in fact considered symbolic by the culture, and understood also as a mystical propitiatory sacrifice. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content, and at the same time you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. According to the French sinologist J. Bourgon, a specialist in Chinese law, this term would be a loan from the Turanian languages, a foreign word that arrived from the steppes, with the Khitan, a Proto-Mongolian people who had founded the Liao dynasty in 907 AD. Therefore, from a Chinese perspective, this execution method had a foreign or barbaric origin. Now, to close this point in the most horrific way possible, there are also mentions, if this
I honestly think that the first ones is still worse.
It's true that the parts of the body that were cut during the execution were distributed among the crowd and cannibalism occurred. Now, if that's true or not,
Oh my god! Oh no! Forget what I said. Forget what I just said. Just forget it.
I'll leave it to you. Let's go to the next one.
No, I'm okay.
Tracing
I'm
a
not
history of
sleepy or
crucifixion
anything.
proves to be much more difficult than expected, and this is because the term used in ancient texts to indicate crucifixion and impalement are overlapping and easily confused. If, in fact, initially one wanted to attribute the origin of crucifixion to the Persians, starting from the multilingual inscription of Behistun, found in Iran and in which Darius I of Persia records the execution of the Babylonian rebel Araka and his followers, the terminology used, the Aramaic word and the Akkadian word, seem to lean more towards impalement. The Akkadian word in particular holds the meaning of plant, but also have an active sexual relationship, as further reinforcement that the aorist offers, starting from the Assyrians, a wide iconographic repertoire that does not show crucifixion, but rather impalements. So even though originally the idea of crucifixion being connected in its origin to the Persians was the norm, now this has been challenged, mostly due to the fact that we don't have a lot of iconography to back up imprecision in the terminology used. Therefore, we'll move now to Greek. The Greek term
But I mean, all of them are terrible. But honestly, if we compare now we have to we can say that if we have to compare like impalement with the previous two ones, like at least impalement you die right after, like the other ones you keep suffering and you die anyway. So I mean, the first one you die actually like way faster than the second, but it's way more slowly than impalement as well. I don't know. They are so terrible. But I think if you have to choose one, it would need to be the fastest.
which is conventionally translated and used in the Testaments as crucify, is often used in pre-Christian sources to describe the execution of the exposure of the bodies of the condemned, actually originally referred to the practice of impalement. While today, this word indicates the cross in modern Greek, in ancient Greek the term simply means stake. In the Odyssey, for example, this term is used to indicate the components of the palisade that form the enclosure of Eumaneus pigs. In fact, the first certain attestation of a practice similar.
So I'm not talking about crucifixion. Like I'm talking about impalement, where like you guys know exactly what it is. It's not this,
To crucifixion the way we imagine it is not to an Eastern people but to the Greeks themselves, who ironically inflicted on the Persians. Herodotus writes, during Ariphoron's son, Xanthipus' leadership of the Athenians, the Greeks took Arteichtes, a Persian man and governor of Sestos, and nailed him alive to a board. He used to bring women into the temple of Protesilaus at Elaeus and do impious deeds. Herodotus will now describe this execution in details. They hanged him nailed to boards, and they will stone his son before his eyes. Please note that the verbs used by Herodotus in this case leave absolutely no doubt this is nailing. It is important to underline that both Julius Caesar, Julius Caesar, and Livy, as they talk about crucifixion as a system, they say that this was practiced by both the Numidians and the Carthaginians, but we don't know, considering the fact that this crucifixion was not very common among them, if that means that we should imagine that the Romans took this system or method from them. Within the Roman context, in fact, the first certain attestation of a crucifixion is related to the punishment meted out by Caesar himself to the pirates who had taken him prisoner. We read in Plutarch that the future conqueror of Gaul, following his release upon payment of the ransom, had taken it upon himself to pursue, catch and condemn the pirates to be nailed to a stake. Due to the tremendous suffering caused by this system, according to Roman law, crucifixion...
What? What did you say it like? I mean, if some records are true, Vlad was good enough with impalement that some people took hours to days to die. Man was a little too good at his craft. No, I don't think that's possible. If we are talking about real impalement, like it's just not possible, because you know exactly where the stake needs to enter at and where it needs to end at, and you know that that is not possible because it has to pass through a lot of vital organs. There's no way you're not gonna touch any of these vital organs that the person will not die instantly. It's just impossible. I mean, in my opinion, it's just impossible too. I don't believe people actually last hours or what's more like days in that situation. It's not possible.
Could be imposed as a capital punishment exclusively on those who were not Roman citizen. This is one of the reasons why, for example, Peter was crucified, but Paul, who was a Roman citizen, was beheaded instead. Just as it appears difficult to distinguish between crucifixion and impalement in ancient sources, when moving in the field of crucifixion it appears difficult to define.
You may avoid, I think you can may avoid the heart and maybe the, some other vital organs, but you cannot avoid arteries and things like that. There is no way a person survives.
With certainty the shape of the wooden structure to which the victims were nailed, which in reality could be of different shapes, from a single stake driven into the ground to a real cross, straight or oblique. The issue becomes even more complex when we start reading Seneca on the matter, because we see that indeed the Romans applied the term crux, which means cross, onto a variety of things, which ranged from the instrument of crucifixion to that of impalement. Let's read. I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but many in many different ways. Some have their victims with heads down to the ground, some impale the private parts, others stretch out their arms on the gibbet. From a merely mechanical standpoint, crucifixion was an extremely painful way to go. But if you're interested into the medical details and all the mechanical aspects of it, then I would refer you to my dedicated video, link in the description. That one didn't get demonetized, somehow. Hanging, followed by disembowelment and quartering, is a punishment that appears in medieval England, usually linked to the crime of treason against the crown.
That's
the first
terrible.
to suffer this form of capital punishment was the Welsh prince Dafydd ap Gruffudd in 1283, who had rebelled against Edward I Longshark, King of England. As he was captured, the Welsh prince was led through the streets of Shrewsbury and subjected to mockery, beatings, and the throwing of stones and rotten fruit by the crowd. This is called drawn. Then he was hanged by the neck until he lost consciousness. This is hanged. He then received the disembowelment, and his insides were burnt before his eyes. He was then beheaded, and his body quartered, with the 4 parts sent to the cities that symbolized the 4 furthest points of Edward's kingdom: Bristol, York, Hereford, and Northampton. A similar fate was famously bestowed to the Scottish rebel William Wallace in 1305. It was during the reign of Edward III in 1351 that the Treason Act was promulgated, which explained in detail what the crime of high treason was, and the, of course, drawn, hanged and quartering penalty was described in detail on how it should be applied. From that moment onward, the system of punishment was imposed legally only on men, the reason being that they didn't want to, in the medieval period, expose women's nudity. Therefore, a man would be drawn, hanged and quartered, but a woman would be drawn, hanged and burnt. Yeah, oh yeah, you can't show the crowd a naked woman, but you can show a man being cut into pieces. Whatever. Medieval. Until the 1600s, cases are documented in which the condemned were often fully conscious during the removal of their viscera, but in the 1700s it appears clear that the victims were decapitated before undergoing disembowelment. From the early 1800s, although maintaining the nomenclature, the punishment effectively involved simply decapitating the corpse, following the hanging. Martyrdom by boiling is attributed to many saints in the Christian tradition, such as Saint Eulampia, Saint Cecilia, Saint Phocas of Sinope, and many others. While in most cases these are probably fabricated traditions, it is interesting to note that Tertullian, a Roman author and Christian apologist, in his work De Praescriptione Hereticorum, refers to an ordeal undergone by Saint John, the apostle, who was thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil and miraculously survived. Now, what's important to say about this is that Tertullian wrote in the 2nd century, which means that whatever he's describing happened a century, a whole 100 years before. Now, without going into the merits of the actual miracle, what we are discussing here when it comes to history is that we can learn that most likely the practice of boiling people alive was indeed practiced by the Romans. And as we read more period sources, we see that oftentimes this would happen in the circus. During the Middle Ages in England, death by boiling seems to have been imposed for crimes related to poisoning, while in Central Europe it was a punishment inflicted particularly on counterfeiters. In Japan, death by boiling is linked to the semi-legendary folk hero Ishikawa Goemon, who lived during the Sengoku period. According to tradition, Goemon was captured while breaking into the house of the despotic daimyo Toyotomi Hideyoshi, with the intent to kill him, and was thus condemned, along with his family, to death by boiling. Goemon is depicted within Japanese art while undergoing this proceeding, holding a sangobe high with outstretched arms. The explanation of this symbolic gesture has two different traditions. Either he was showing the horrible nature of what they had done, so the son has already died and he's showing it to the authorities. Alternatively, he was trying to save him by holding him outside the boiling cauldron in order to avoid the son from falling into it. What's interesting is that in memory of the hero, the traditional metal tubs used in Japan for hot baths in rural areas are still called Goemon Buro. The first reference to the Blood Eagle emerges from a handful of cryptic verses of skaldic poetry composed between 1020 and 1038 by Sigvatr Þórðarson in honor of Canute the Great, King of Denmark, Norway and England. In the verses known as Knutsdrapa, Sigva recites, "And Ella's back had the one who dwelt, Ivar with eagle yoke cut." Now, skaldic poetry is known for being mysterious, rich in elusive metaphors called kenning, and the proposed interpretation to date is as follows. "And Ivar, the one who dwelt at York, had Ella's back cut with an eagle." The verses refer to Ivar the Boneless, whom in 865 AD had allegedly captured King Aelle, an Anglo-Saxon king of Northumbria, in order to avenge his father, Ragnar Lothbrok. This theme is taken up by Saxo Grammaticus, who, in the Gesta Danorum, attributes the execution method of Aelle to two other sons of Ragnar, Björn and Sigvard, who, as we read, ordered the figure of an eagle to be cut in his back, rejoicing to crush their most ruthless foe by marking him with the cruelest of birds. Not satisfied with impressing a wound on him, they salted the mangled flesh. Apparently, the description seems to be that of an execution method which involved cutting the shape of an eagle into the victim's back and then, at least according to Saxo Grammaticus, rubbing salt into the wound. But as we continue to look for sources to describe this more in details, an even more horrible picture is painted. In the second half of the 9th century, roughly the same year as that saw the execution of Aelle, the blood eagle was inflicted on another warlord,
Yes,
Halfdan
I'm
Longleg,
double color.
the Wanderer. He was one of the many sons of the king of Norway, Harald Fairhair. Dissatisfied with the position his father had carved out for him, not particularly superior to that of any other Norwegian nobleman, he allegedly took to piracy and looting in the company of his brother, Gudrud. First, the brothers attacked a Norwegian county, setting fire to the home of Earl Rogvald the Wise, after barring the exit from the outside, thus killing the nobleman and his 60 warrior entourage. Subsequently, while he established himself as a lord of the country, Halfdan, with a small fleet of 3 longship, headed to the Orkneys, where he caught the son of the late Rognvald by surprise, forcing him to flee to Scotland and thus occupying the islands. However, already the same year, Einar would return in force, scattering his soldiers and capturing him. According to what we read in the sagas that were written in the 12th century, in order to take revenge against the wrongdoings of Halfdan, a terrible execution method was enforced. But let's read it. Einar made them carve an eagle on his back with a sword, and cut the ribs all from the backbone, and draw the lungs thereout, and gave him to Odin for the victory he had won. In the Heimskringla saga, written later in 1230, it would have been Einar himself who carried out the execution. As we read, afterwards, Earl Einar went up to Halfdan and cut the blood eagle on his back, in this fashion that he thrust his sword into his chest by the backbone and severed all of the ribs down to the loins, and then pulled out the lungs, and that was Halfdan's death. The blood eagle subsequently appears into the tales of the legendary Danish warrior Nornagestr, written in 1300, where one reads, "Now is the bloody eagle with a broad sword carved on the back of the killer of Sigmund." Finally, it is in the history of the Sons of Ragnar, which was written in the 13th century, that we see an even more detailed description that kind of connects everything we read today, from Grammaticus to the descriptions in the sagas that we have examined. We read, "The Sons of Ragnar caused the bloody eagle to be carved on the back of Aella, and they cut away all of the ribs from the spine, and then they ripped out his lungs. To date, the opinions of scholars of Scandinavian history are conflicting, and although, according to some, the bloody eagle should be understood as an elaborate kenning, originally relating to simply describing the body of an enemy lying face down on the battlefield, on which birds of prey feast, and subsequently misunderstood by later authors as a method of executions, others are in favor of recognizing it as an actual practice, which, in its brutality, would have been connected to avenging the death of one's father. Escapism of the boat's execution is reported by Plutarch in Parallel Lives. According to the account, which Plutarch probably acquired from Dacius, Artaxerxes allegedly inflicted this incredibly cruel punishment on a soldier in his army named Mithridates. Mithridates, in the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BC, had killed Cyrus the Younger, who is Artaxerxes' brother, who had risen against him to contend for the throne, with an arrow. For this, Mithridates had been rewarded with rich gifts, but since Artaxerxes wanted to spread the news that he had personally killed his brother, he officially rewarded the soldiers for having delivered to him. He officially rewarded the soldier for having delivered him. After capturing him, he was condemned with the following punishment. We read, "The king decreed that Mithridates should be put to death in boats, which execution is after the following manner. Taking 2 boats framed exactly to fit and answer each other, they lie down in one of them the malefactor that suffers upon his back, then covering it with the other, and so setting them together that the head, hands, and feet of him are left outside, and the rest of the body lies shut within. They offer him food, and if he refuses to eat, they force him to do it by prickling his eyes. Then, after he has eaten, they drench him with a mixture of milk and honey, pouring it not only into his mouth, but all over his face.
Oh,
they
I
then
remember
keep his
this one,
face
I
continually
remember.
turned towards the sun, and it becomes completely covered up and hidden by the multitude of flies that settle on it. And as within the boats, he does what those that eat and drink must need to. Creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption and rottenness of the excrement, and these entering into the bowels of him, his body is consumed. When the man is manifestly dead, the uppermost boat being taken off, they find his flesh devoured, and swarms of such noisome creatures preying upon, and, in the verse growing, to his inwards. In this way, Mithridates, after suffering for 17 days, at last expired. It is important to underline, however, that apart from Plutarch, there is only one more mention from a different author,
I already know
and
this
the
one,
source is
but
in
this
fact
one
precisely the same as
wins.
Plutarch. And considering the
believe.
fact that even though this should in theory be connected to the Persians, we find no mention of this execution method within Persian literature, it is also possible that this was created in order to sort of vilify and make the Persians look even more cruel, but who knows. The poena cullei, or penalty of the sack, is a particularly elaborate method of execution that the Romans inflicted on those who were guilty of parricide, and subsequently extending it to those who were guilty of the crime of the closest relatives beyond the father, such as the mother and the grandparents. The first testimonies regarding the poena cullei are recalled by Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Valerius Maximus, who trace its first application back to Tarquinius Superbus, although in this case the person who is accused of the crime is actually not accused of having committed any patricide or matricide or anything like that, and the crime being that he had divulged the contents of Sibylline books that he should have instead guarded. And considering the fact that these books that were supposed to remain secret had to do with the gods, the idea was, well, if you usually execute someone with this method who has killed his own parents, then in this case, well, the gods are our parents, so that's how they connected it. But what this poena cullei actually consists of, and how was the method executed? Well, let's go. The condemned had his head
So, because the guy read a book or something? Really? Oh my god.
covered by a
I mean, he could even read?
wolfskin hood, and after having taken an ignominious walk on high wooden clogs, exposed to public mockery, and after being whipped until bloody with rods, was placed in a sack, the so-called culleus, and then thrown into a river or the sea. Covering the head of a condemned man meant consecrating him to the gods, and the wolfskin had a double meaning. It served not only to connote him as a monster, but also recalled an ancient ceremonial practice derived from Greek mythology, according to which the guilty of particularly heinous crimes was punished with the transformation into a wolf, and consequently erased from the civil community. Regarding the wooden clogs, it was believed that wood had the ability to prevent an object or individual from spreading evil influences, which which he would be carrying with him, and forcing the person who had killed his own father to walk with wooden soles, which basically meant preventing him from poisoning everyone else. Now, along with the condemned, several different animals would be also put inside the sack that was on top of his head. Now, these would vary, but in general we're talking about a rooster, a viper, a dog, and a monkey. The presence of the beast made the execution of the punishment a lot more cruel, but above all, it accentuated its symbolic value. The rooster, an animal linked to light, was connected to the fact that one would have killed his own father because he kills the one who gave him life. According to the sources, the one used for the poema Cule was the capon, a beast considered fierce. In the book De Re Rustica it is read that the rooster kills snakes. The presence of both animals in the Culeus was therefore to give rise to a chain of killing that, just as the patricide had done, altered civil coexistence. The symbolism of the viper was linked instead to what was handed down by Pliny, according to whom its young, ready to be born by the mother and impatient to come to light, emerged from her side, killing her. This belief was also handed down to us by Pliny himself. Now, when it comes to the dog, well, it's very difficult to evaluate its presence, which must be said, in classical sources is presented as being of dual nature. On one hand, a faithful companion of a man and defender of the home and flocks, and on the other, a dirty animal, which feeds on corpses, and which the poet Horace defines as an unclean beast. Finally, the monkey, according to Pliny, loved its own offspring so much that it suffocated them in their embraces. Moreover, due to its resemblance to man, it was considered a horrifying caricature of him. In fact, we know that Cicero writes that the monkey is a man who is not worth a penny. These beasts were inserted into the Culeus both to torture the culprit, and because after his death probably his remains and those of the animals would have emerged into a single ossuary. The first reference to capital execution by means of burning at the stake are present in the famous Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, dated to the 18th century BC, and are related to different crimes, namely the looting of a house, taking advantage of its fire, the frequenting of taverns by a priestess, and incest between mother and son. We read, "If fire breaks out in a house, and someone who comes to put it out cast his eye upon the property of the owner of the house, and take the property of the master of the house, he shall be thrown into that self-same fire. If a sister of a god enter a tavern to drink, then shall this woman be burnt to death. If anyone be guilty of incest with his mother after his father died, both shall be burnt." Death by fire also appears occasionally in Egyptian documents as a form of punishment for those who rebelled against the authority of the pharaoh. Julius Caesar, or Julius Caesar, reports that the use among the Gauls of executing human sacrifices by burning the victim alive, although his reference to the preference for thieves and murderers as victims suggests an activity halfway between sacrifice and capital punishment for crime. In the De Bello Gallico, we read, "Some Gallic tribes have simulacra of extraordinary size, the limbs of which, interwoven with twigs, they fill with living men, and when these have been set on fire, the men, enveloped by the flames, expire. They believe that the sacrifices of those who have been caught in theft or robbery or some other crime are more pleasing to the immortal gods, but when the availability of this category is lacking, they also resort to the sacrifice of the innocent." Among the Romans, executions by burning at the stake was instead linked to the spectacularization of punishment in the circus, although it must have been a less widespread practice that is commonly imagined. While it is normally assumed that the tunica molesta, uncomfortable tunic, mentioned by various authors was a highly flammable tunic used as a torment for Christians by Nero, in reality it appears in the sources more as a rough and uncomfortable garment, made to be worn by the condemned for shame and mockery. However, Tacitus openly declares the use of fire as a means of execution by Nero during the persecution against Christians. In the Annales, we read, "And derision accompanied their end. They were covered with the tunica molesta, and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses, and, when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night." Another reference to the death penalty inflicted by burning at the stake in ancient Rome appears in Flavius Josephus, who reports how hundreds of Jewish prisoners of war were burnt alive by Titus. Subsequently, the penalty of burning at the stake was formalized in Justinian Code, established for for heretics, laying the foundation for what was a canon throughout the Middle Ages and a good part of the modern age. In fact, burning at the stake became the preferred method for carrying out capital executions imposed for crimes related to the religious and sacred sphere, whether these were heresies or witchcraft. If death by combustion is linked to the sacred sphere, probably due to the metaphor that sees fire as a purifying entity, it must have been terribly painful, death occurring due to cardiac collapse caused by intense pain or damage to internal organs from high temperatures. If the fire was not exclusively violent, death could occur by asphyxiation due to the smoke, and if friends and relatives of the condemned found a complacent and corruptible executioner, the latter could strangle or break the neck of the condemned when they were secured to a stake before the flames began. In Europe, the last known sentence of capital punishment for being burnt at the stake occurred in the late 19th century. The first attestation of capital execution by flaying appears in the archives of Ashurnasirpal II, an Assyrian monarch who reigned between 883 and 859 BC. I don't know how to pronounce that name.
Honestly, I mean, none of them are good, but honestly, compared with the others, that one was like nothing.
By the way, we read, I have made a pillar facing the city gate, and have flayed all the rebel leaders. I have clad the pillar in the flayed skins. I let the leaders of the conquered cities be flayed, and clad the city walls with their skins. In the Greek world, the practice of flaying seemed to be linked exclusively to the sphere of myth, with Apollo flaying the satyr Marsyas alive, guilty of having challenged the god in the art of music, and Athena flaying one of the giant alive, in some versions of Pallas, in other Antaeus. It remains difficult to define whether these traditions reflect a use, however occasional, of the practice. On the contrary, Greek sources refer to at least one execution by flaying in the Persian context, with Herodotus reporting that the Persian emperor Cambyses had condemned the corrupt judge Sisamis to be flayed. If flaying appears occasionally among the forms of martyrdom of saints, the actual historicity of these episodes is strongly debated, although, for example, the martyrdom of Saint Bartholomew the Apostle, which according to tradition took place in the east at the will of the king of the Parthians, would see a coherence with the specific customs and the geographical and cultural area. In medieval Europe, flaying appears sporadically, inflicted as a punishment for particularly serious faults, such as the theft of ecclesiastical property or the killing of kings. In 1199, Richard the Lionheart died as a result of an infected and cancerous wound from a crossbow dart inflicted on him during the siege of the castle of Chalus-Chabrol in France, while he was intent on suppressing the revolt of Viscount Aymar V of Limoges. The person responsible, captured and brought before the king while he was still alive, turned out to be a 15-year-old boy whose name varies according to different reference sources. The boy declared that he had tried to kill the king because he was responsible for the death of his father and brothers. Aware that he was on the verge of death, to be certain of gaining the kingdom of heaven, Richard forgave the boy and let him go with 100 shillings. But Roger of Hovden, in the Gesta Regis Ricardi, reports that after his death, the Occitan mercenary captain Mercadier, in the pay of the English, would have stormed Chalus-Chabrol and flayed the boy alive. Certainly, however, the most famous sentence for flaying reported by historical sources is the one suffered by the Venetian general Marcantonio Bragadin at the hands of the Turkish general of Serbian origin Lala Kara Mustafa Pasha after the capture of Famagusta on the island of Cyprus in 1571. Although according to what is reported by Christian chronicles, Mustafa had promised to save the lives of the besieged of Famagusta if they surrendered. Immediately after the surrender, the Turks indulged in terrible atrocities and cruelties. Bragadin was scourged, his ears and nose were cut off, and finally, according to the chronicler Riccardo Riccoboni, who wrote shortly after the events, we read, finally brought to the main square of Salamis, destined for the torment of the guilty, and stripped of his clothes, he was tied to the franc pole, and by the executioner he was started to be flayed, starting from the back and shoulders, then passing to the arms and neck, exclaiming in jest, that perfidious tyrant, Mustafa Pasha, become a Turk if you want to be saved. That most patient martyr answered nothing, but lifting his head to the heavens, he said, Jesus Christ my Lord, have mercy on me. Into your hands I commend my spirit. Receive, my God, this my miserable soul, and forgive those who know not what they do. Having completed removing his skin from his head and chest, and arriving at the navel, the most tolerant and constant man, persevering in the faith of Jesus Christ, flew to the one whose divinity he had testified with his most holy martyrdom. The skin filled with straw and adorned with his usual garment, and with a red hat partly covering the head, perfectly adapted, as if it were a living body, was brought through the city and through all the streets on an ox, or cow, with 2 Turks accompanying it, who seemed to serve it, one of whom held the umbrella to the face, and followed by the noise of many drums and trumpets, so that greater terror would be imprinted on the people, frightened, reciting by edict with a grave voice the following words: "Behold your lord, come to observe him, greet him, venerate him, so that you may receive from him the reward of so many of your labors and your fidelity." Alright, number ones, well, I hope that you enjoyed, should I say, this video, but you found it interesting and informational. If you did, please remember thumbs up, and if you're not yet...
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. What else can we say? It's difficult actually calling this something else. Like, we are talking about methods of torture, so yeah. That I think this is the expected reason in the end of such a videos like this, right? Yeah. I just want to remind you guys to check out our Discord server, be part of the amazing Fox Links community. You can find the links for the Discord server on the link tree or on the links below in case you are watching on Vtube. Support this Fox right here. You can do that through the link tree as well, or links below, or Ko-Fi. I need your support to stay here because I'm totally limited on Vtube, as many of you guys know already. Like, it cut like 90% or so of my reach. So yeah, I'm counting on you guys to stay here. Before we go any further, I want to take this brief moment here to thank all of you, my patrons, for the incredible support to my work here on YouTube, and especially my 5-tail Fox Tier member, the Holy Ball, and to all of my 3-tail Fox Tier members, Wallony Wolf, Fanny Sylvie, Eat Himself, Chile Not Serious, Eustace the Useful, Zealous Isaiah, Ala Rosas, Max Tenor, Nugutino, Avery, Halcyonic Eder, and TV8. Thank you very, very much. You guys are amazing. Also, thanks to everyone that have been supporting me on Ko-Fi, Kick, and to all of my YouTube members. You can support this channel life and growth with just $5 a month and gain access to many perks. This is less than a burrito. Check out my Patreon. Link is in the description below. And that's it for today, my dear Fox Links. See you guys in the next one. Bye bye.